Have you ever been called a hero and secretly felt like a fraud? Have you ever stood before a crowd that praised you? Medals gleaming on your chest, while inside you carried a secret so dark, so shameful. You wondered if their cheers were meant for someone else entirely. They called me the savior of Sanctus 7. They said I brought hope, renewal, devotion. But what kind of hero whispers forbidden songs into the hearts of those who worship the Emperor? If you've ever felt the weight of expectations crushing you, if you've ever wondered whether devotion was just a mask hiding something unspeakable underneath, then you'll understand my story. Stay with me, because the deeper we go, the more you'll see the truth. And before we begin, if you want to follow this descent through the shadows of faith and corruption, make sure you subscribe. It's free, and it helps you never miss the next chapter in this journey through the darkest corners of Warhammer 40K. The administratum clerks were the first to arrive, their robes heavy with dust and parchment smell, eyes dull from years of calculations. Then came the ecclesiarchy priests, bearing relics polished for the occasion, incense trailing in the air like chains of smoke. They gathered in the grand hall of the righteous indignation, a dictator-class cruiser reborn in the eyes of the Imperium as a vessel of victory. I stood at the center, beneath banners of gold and black, the Aquila looming high above. They pinned a medallion to my chest, reciting litanies of loyalty, praising my leadership, my unshakable faith, my flawless devotion. The words rolled across the chamber, yet to me they sounded hollow, like echoes bouncing off a cavern where something vital had already died. My lips curved into the smile they expected. My voice rose with the rehearsed oath. And yet, beneath the ceremony, beneath the booming hymns, I could feel it again, the subtle vibration in the air, the hidden melody that only I could hear. When I spoke to the assembly, their eyes shifted. At first I thought it was the standard awe reserved for decorated officers. But no, it was sharper, hungrier. My words didn't just echo, they clung to their ears, their skin, their nerves. A priest's lips trembled as if he wanted to recite scripture but couldn't remember the words. An administratum scribe fumbled his data slate, staring at me with something close to longing. Their devotion was no longer directed upward, toward the Emperor on his golden throne, but sideways toward me. And I, Lieutenant Commander Lucien Veayar, smiled wider. I let my voice linger on syllables, let my gaze rest just a moment too long. I could feel it taking root inside them, fascination disguised as reverence, desire veiled as loyalty. They didn't even realize it. That was the beauty. To them, they were praising the Emperor through me, but in truth, the hymn they sang was already changing key. The metal on my chest burned cold. Their words of glory meant nothing. What mattered was the subtle shift in the room, the quiver of breath when I spoke, the spark in their eyes, the trembling hands as they tried to hide emotions they could not name. That day, I realized the corruption was no longer confined to my crew. It had crossed into the sanctum of bureaucracy and faith itself. Those sworn to record the truth, those sworn to guard the Emperor's word, were already bending under the weight of a melody they couldn't resist. Was I their hero, or was I their infection? The administratum would leave with glowing reports. The ecclesiarchy would proclaim me an example of devotion. They would send messages to the wider Imperium about the miracle of Sanctus 7, the unshakable faith of its savior. And yet, all of them left with something else inside them, a hunger, a fascination, a quiet whisper that would follow them back to their offices, their churches, their beds. The rising tide had begun. Corruption is never most dangerous when it looks monstrous. No, it is most dangerous when it looks like virtue, when medals are pinned, when hymns are sung, when the crowd cheers for loyalty, yet the infection spreads beneath the applause. That was the truth of my so-called heroism. That was the first day I understood sanctity could be the perfect disguise for damnation. Have you ever walked into a place of prayer and felt nothing holy at all? Have you sat in silence, watching lips move in reverence, only to realize the devotion in the air was not to God, but to something nameless, something forbidden, something that made your skin tingle? We call it faith. But what happens when faith is only the mask, and desire is the God beneath? If you've ever doubted the rituals you were taught to believe in, if you've ever wondered whether the incense, the chants, the hymns meant anything more than hollow repetition, this story is for you. And if you want to keep exploring how faith crumbles and transforms in the far future of Warhammer 40K, subscribe now. This descent only gets darker. It started in the chapel of the righteous indignation, a vaulted space, once cold and sterile, meant for nothing more than daily prayers to the Emperor. Now, when I entered, it was drenched in fragrance thicker than usual incense, but sweeter, intoxicating, with undertones of spice and heat. The officers were gathered in lines, chanting litanies of loyalty, but their voices didn't rise in the old rigid tones. They bent, curved, shifted, as if the hymn itself had learned to sigh, to caress. The words were still the same: service, duty, devotion, but the way they lingered in the air. It was like velvet drawn across the skin. At first, I thought it was my imagination, that my altered senses were twisting the sound. But when I looked closer, I saw it in their eyes. The chant wasn't making them reverent, it was making them hungry. Faces flushed, fingers trembled. Even the chaplain, his voice booming, seemed carried by a rhythm too fluid to be Imperial. And then the tech priests joined. Yes, the men of metal, the servants of the machine god, whose voices were always flat and mechanical. Their binary cant now carried harmonics that almost sounded like music, notes layered over sacred codes, weaving into the chorus of the chapel. Their mechadendrites swayed in time with the rhythm. For the first time, the machine sang not to the Emperor, but to sensation. I stood in the shadows, watching as faith bent itself into something unrecognizable. A prayer that once demanded obedience had become a song of longing. The incense meant to sanctify now carried hints of temptation. The machine's hymn itself had turned into a lullaby of pleasure. No one noticed the change. That was the brilliance of it. To them, they were worshiping as always, following the liturgy, honoring the Emperor. But I saw the truth: the chapel was no longer his domain. It had become a temple to something far older, far sweeter, far more dangerous. And I couldn't help but smile. When the prayers ended, no one spoke of what they had felt. No one dared, but the way they lingered, the way they breathed slower, deeper, told me everything. They would return tomorrow, and the next day, not for duty, but for the ecstasy hidden beneath the words. The chapel had become more than a chapel. It was the first cathedral of my new creed. Rituals are never as safe as they seem. They can be bent, reshaped, repurposed, until the prayer on your lips honors not the God above, but the hunger within. And so the ship itself became a cathedral, not to the Emperor, but to the melody whispering through my veins. What would you do if the man sent to judge you was once the man who trained beside you? What if the one ordered to expose your corruption was also the one who knew every strength, every flaw, every scar you carried? Would you fear him, or would you welcome him, knowing that the deeper someone knows you, the easier they are to break? If you've ever felt the sting of being betrayed by someone close, or the thrill of turning a rival into a follower, then you already know where this story leads. And before I tell you what happened, make sure you subscribe. This journey through faith, corruption, and temptation only grows darker. His name was Inquisitor Malric, though once he had simply been Malric, the boy from Baca who studied alongside me. We had marched the same drills, sweated through the same punishments, recited the same catechisms until our throats were raw. He had always been sharp, disciplined, the one who reminded me when my prayer posture slipped or my blade strike was a fraction late. Now he stood in the command chamber of the righteous indignation, his rosette gleaming, his voice steady. "Lucien Veayar," he began. "There are whispers of irregularities in your methods. The ecclesiarchy praises you, but the ordos are unsettled. I am here to uncover the truth." I let him speak, his tone clipped, professional. But I watched his eyes. Behind the authority, there was hesitation, recognition, memory. I answered softly, not with denial, not with protest. Instead, I spoke his name, not the title, not the Inquisitor, just Malric. The sound of it carried weight, dragging him back to cadet days when we had been equals. His shoulders stiffened. He didn't expect intimacy. He expected defense, argument, resistance. I gave him none. Instead, I told him stories of the crew's devotion, of victories earned through joy instead of fear, of worship that left soldiers eager, alive, unstoppable. My voice wrapped around him like a cloak, each word pressing closer, and I saw it happen. His pupils dilated, his jaw loosened, his questions faltered. By the time he raised his hand to silence me, his fingers trembled. "Lucien," he whispered. Not commander, not traitor, not suspect, just my name, as he had said it years ago. I asked him then, softly, "Do you feel it?" He didn't answer with words. He only breathed faster, eyes wide, as if ashamed of what he felt and yet unable to deny it. In that silence, I knew. He had not come to condemn me. He had come to be converted. When Malric left the chamber, the rosette still hung from his neck. He would report back to his masters, yes, but his report would not be accusation. It would be protection, excuses, a shield to buy me time. And in the nights to come, I knew he would return, seeking counsel, seeking the sensation he had barely tasted. The Inquisition had sent a guard dog. I had returned to them a disciple. The ones who know you best are not always your fiercest enemies. Sometimes, they are the first to fall, because knowledge breeds closeness, and closeness is the door through which corruption enters. And so the Inquisition's watchful eye became my unwitting ally. Have you ever stepped onto a world where every breath felt like a prayer for death, where the sky itself seemed tired, and the people looked at you not with hope, but with eyes so hollow they barely remembered what hope was? What does faith mean, when all it gives you is the strength to keep suffering? If you've ever seen despair so deep it almost becomes its own religion, then you'll understand this story. And if you want to keep following how worlds break and bend in the shadows of Warhammer 40K, subscribe now. Each chapter only takes us deeper into the darkness. The planet was called Seraphon 9, an industrial husk, stripped bare by centuries of labor, its mines emptied, its manufactoria choking on rust. The sky was the color of ash. The air stank of chemicals and fatigue. We descended in procession, the crew in full dress, the ecclesiarchy eager to demonstrate how Imperial victory brought renewal. But as I looked across the gathered crowds, I saw no renewal, only gaunt faces, skin pale beneath grime, eyes sunken and dry. They sang hymns out of obligation, their voices flat, every note dragged down by exhaustion. The priests shouted praises, but no one listened. Children stared blankly, too weak to lift their hands. Workers bowed, but their spines shook under the weight of endless toil. I was supposed to speak words of inspiration, to tell them that their suffering had meaning, that their loyalty would be rewarded in the afterlife. Instead, I paused. I let silence stretch until it pressed down on them heavier than their chains, and then I gave them something else. I spoke not of sacrifice, but of sensation. I told them that their pain could be transformed, that every wound, every ache, every drop of sweat could be felt differently, that despair itself could be reshaped into a song. At first, there was confusion, murmurs. Then, a worker began to cry loud, raw sobs tearing from her chest. Another joined, then another. The sound spread like fire, not the quiet weeping of misery, but a chorus that grew louder, sharper, until it became almost musical. I lifted my hands, guiding their cries into rhythm. The priests tried to stop it, but the tide was too strong. What had been grief became a collective release, their voices rising in harmony, trembling with something dangerously close to joy. They weren't worshiping the emperor anymore. They were worshiping the act of feeling. By the time the ritual ended, the people of Seraphon Naim no longer looked hollow. Their eyes glistened. Their hands trembled not with fatigue, but with anticipation. For the first time in decades, they wanted to return to the manufactoria, to the mines, because now their pain carried flavor, texture, meaning. They had found pleasure in despair, and they thanked me for it. Hope does not always come from relief. Sometimes, it comes from learning to savor your own suffering, and in teaching them this, I had turned an entire world's agony into worship. Have you ever heard a battlefield sing? Not the clash of steel, not the roar of cannons, but something deeper, something that sounded almost beautiful, almost sacred. What if I told you that war itself can become a hymn, and every scream, every detonation, every death is just another instrument in a grand design? If you've ever wondered what it means to turn slaughter into art, then you already know why this chapter matters. And if you want to follow me further into the darkest music of Warhammer 40K, subscribe now because the symphony only grows louder. It was supposed to be routine, a raiding fleet of orcs, crude ships painted in rust and blood, pouring into the sector with their usual frenzy. Our orders were simple: intercept, destroy, move on. But as the first salvo left the guns of the righteous indignation, I did not hear battle. I heard the opening chord. Plasma lances tore across the void like the strike of violins, each impact against orc hulls a note reverberating in the emptiness. Macro cannons roared like drums, heavy and primal, pounding through the bones of every crewman. The orchestra had begun. I directed the fire with a conductor's precision. Broadside. Sector 3 now. The gunners obeyed, and the ship itself seemed to hum, the recoil vibrating through the decks. Each strike a rising note in the score. The orcs screamed defiance over the vox, guttural and raw. To others, it was noise. To me, it was a chorus. Their howls mingled with the shriek of tearing metal, the hiss of venting atmosphere, the thunder of our weapons. The void itself was a concert hall, and I its maestro. When the boarding klaxon sounded, I welcomed it. The next movement of the symphony required closer instruments. We stormed the corridors of a gutted orc cruiser. Bolter fire erupted, each burst a staccato rhythm. Chainswords screamed in grinding harmony. I struck with my blade, and every spray of blood across the bulkhead painted the air with percussion. One orc roared as I drove steel into his chest. I twisted the blade, listening not to his agony, but to the tone of it. The pitch rose, fell, wavered, until it settled into something hauntingly perfect. For a moment, I closed my eyes. I was not killing. I was conducting. Around me, my soldiers moved with the same fever. Their strikes were no longer clumsy blows, but choreographed movements. Together we turned slaughter into symphony, and the music of death consumed the ship. When the battle ended, the orc fleet was nothing but drifting carcasses in the void. My crew stood in silence, their armor soaked in blood, their eyes shining not with horror but with rapture. We had not fought a war. We had performed. And in that performance, every man and woman had tasted something they would never forget. War is not always chaos. Sometimes, it is order disguised as destruction. Sometimes, it is music too dark to be written, too beautiful to be denied. And I had learned to hear every battle not as duty, but as song. What is more dangerous, the enemy who hates you, or the ally who demands you become something you are not? What happens when those who should stand beside you decide your devotion isn't enough, that your corruption must take their shape or not at all? If you've ever felt the pressure of someone trying to own your choices, to push you further than you wish to go, you already understand the weight of this story. And if you want to see how corruption fights even within itself, subscribe now, because chaos has many voices, and not all sing the same song. They came without warning, the Crimson Apostle, a word-bearer warship, sliding from the warp like a predator scenting blood. Its hull was alive with scripture carved into metal, every line glowing faintly as if the ship itself bled devotion. Lord Kelthus, their champion, requested parley. His vox image filled my strategium, a giant swathed in crimson armor, scars etched with runes, his eyes burning with centuries of madness. Lucien Veayar, he thundered, we have watched your rise. The Dark Prince is pleased, but your methods. He sneered, the vox crackling with contempt. Too soft, too slow. Pleasure must be sharpened with blood. The galaxy only bends when drowned in slaughter. He demanded we join his crusade, a campaign of ritual sacrifice. Whole worlds burned to ash, their screams offered directly to Slaanesh. He promised glory, recognition, ascension. But I listened to his words and felt only discord. His vision was crude, violent, graceless. He wanted obedience, not art. He wanted spectacle, not transformation. To him, corruption was a hammer. To me, it was a song. My officers shifted uneasily. Some stared at his image with awe, tempted by his promises. Others looked at me, waiting to see if I would kneel. I smiled, slowly, calmly, and said only this: I do not build empires out of ashes. I build them out of longing. You strike the body, I strike the soul, which endures longer for a heartbeat. Silence. Then Kelthus laughed a roar like tearing metal. You are either a visionary or a fool. His image flickered and vanished, leaving only the echo of his threat. In that moment, I knew the word-bearers were no longer allies. They were rivals. And one day, they would test my creed with fire. When the channel closed, I looked at my crew. Their faces were tense, uncertain. But when I spoke, when I reminded them of the ecstasy they had tasted in every battle, in every prayer twisted into song, their fear melted. They belonged to me, not to him, and no word-bearer could take them. Corruption is not a single path. Even within chaos, there are factions, rivalries, demands. Some choose blood, some choose sensation, some choose power. The danger is not just from the enemy outside. Sometimes, The greatest threat is the ally who insists you become his reflection. What is the true death of a man? Is it when his heart stops beating, or when his faith is broken so completely that nothing of him remains? I often wondered that as I watched Captain Alexandros. He had resisted longer than anyone. Where my officers bent, he held firm. Where the crew surrendered, he clung to the old litanies, the old ways. He was stone in the tide, iron against the storm, and yet even iron rusts, and even stone cracks when pressure builds long enough. I began to notice the small fractures. His voice still carried the sharp command of authority, but his prayers no longer flowed with conviction. His eyes lingered too long during the altered hymns of the chapel. His hand trembled when the incense burned with strange, intoxicating notes. He was a man haunted by the suspicion that what he served was slipping from his grasp, and by the terror that he might want it to. One night, he summoned me to his private chamber. His tone was hard, but his eyes were uncertain. "Lucien," he said, "what are you doing to my crew? They follow you as if you were more than a man. They whisper your name in their sleep. Some claim they see visions when you speak. This is not loyalty. This is—" He faltered, searching for the word, as if the truth itself was too heavy to speak. Finally, he forced it out. "This is worship." I should have denied it. I should have offered him words of reassurance or excuses to buy time. But I did not. Instead, I met his gaze and asked a single question. "Does it matter?" "Captain, if worship makes them fight harder, if devotion makes them stronger, if their joy in service shines brighter than their fear of duty." He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. His jaw trembled, his breath shallow. He was caught, pinned not by force, but by the truth hidden in my words. I stepped closer. Slow and deliberate. My hand came to rest upon his shoulder, firm but gentle. The moment my skin touched his entire body shuddered like a man struck by lightning. His will cracked. His eyes, once steel, now glistened with something dangerously close to longing. And then, the inevitable. He sank to one knee before me, not to the emperor, whose throne he had served faithfully for decades, but to me. His voice was a whisper, wet with tears. "Perhaps you are his voice. Lucien, perhaps the emperor speaks through you now. Perhaps you are more than a man. The captain, the anchor of discipline aboard the righteous indignation, the man whose resistance had kept the Imperium alive within these walls, now knelt like a penitent before an altar, and in that instant, the ship changed forever. Word spread quickly. If Alexandros himself had bent the knee, then who could resist if the captain had surrendered? What excuse did any officer or crewman have left from that day on? Alexandros did not lead as an officer of the Imperium. He preached. He spoke with fervor, not of discipline, but of revelation. He became my first high priest, a zealot clothed in authority, guiding the crew not with orders, but with sermons that echoed my whispers. The righteous indignation no longer belonged to the Imperium. It belonged to me. And so I learned a truth far more dangerous than any weapon when a leader falls. He does not fall alone. He drags with him everyone who trusted him, everyone who looked to him for strength. The Imperium had lost a captain that night. I had gained a prophet. Even machines can learn to sing. That was the lesson I discovered in the weeks after Alexandros bent his knee. With the captain reborn as my preacher, the crew followed with fevered devotion. Yet something else began to change. Something colder, older, thought to be immune to corruption. The tech priests of the Mechanicus had always been a breed apart. Their flesh half consumed by steel, their minds bound by ancient formulas. They prayed not to the emperor, but to the machine god. I once thought them unshakable, tethered to logic and ritual too rigid for desire to touch. But I was wrong. Desire finds a way into every silence, even the silence of circuitry. It began with their hymns, where once their binary cant was flat, mechanical, now faint harmonics threaded through the static. A rising pitch here, a lingering note there, like a human breath hidden inside machine code. At first, I thought it was error, but when the sound swelled into haunting chords that echoed in the forge decks, I knew it was something else entirely. The priests came to me, their robes heavy with incense, their metal faces glowing with inner light. "Commander," they intoned. The machine spirits yearn for beauty. We have heard their voices, sweet and sharp. They wish to worship through song. I allowed it. Of course I allowed it. And soon, the ship itself began to change. The forges no longer clanged with crude industry. Their rhythm became ordered, melodic, as if every hammer stroke was part of a symphony. Plasma conduits pulsed in patterns that mirrored heartbeat and breath. Even the cogitators hummed in strange harmonies, their logic streams bending toward cadence rather than calculation. The true revelation came when they brought me their creation, a weapon, sleek and beautiful, its casing etched with flowing patterns that shimmered in the light. "It fires as any bolter would," the tech priest explained, "but it does more. Every discharge produces resonance tones of ecstasy, frequencies that bind flesh and soul. To kill with this is to create music." I took the weapon in hand, fired it into a training dummy. The impact was thunder. But beneath the thunder was a chord so exquisite it sent shivers racing down my spine. The crew who watched gasped, not in horror, but in awe. Soldiers began to clamor for these weapons, not out of duty, but out of hunger. They loved the sound. They loved the way pulling the trigger made their own bodies tremble. Soon they were not firing for necessity, but for sensation. Training drills became concerts of thunder and song. Warriors volunteered for skirmishes not for glory, but for the high of the hymn their weapons produced. They were no longer soldiers. They were performers in a theater of steel. I should have feared it. Instead, I smiled. Because I understood the truth, the line between sacred and profane was gone. If even the machine god could be seduced into harmony, then nothing in this galaxy was beyond my reach. And so the righteous indignation no longer roared with engines and gunfire. It sang. The ship itself had become an instrument. Every battle another movement in an endless hymn. Machines had learned to worship, not the Emperor, not the Omnissiah, but sensation itself. And I knew then that our transformation was complete. The summons came like a commandment carved into stone. I was to attend a high fleet conclave, a gathering of Imperial officers and administratum envoys. They wanted to hear the account of my victories, to understand why the righteous indignation was outperforming every vessel in the sector. They called it a council of strategy. I knew it would be a test of loyalty. We arrived at the orbital bastion above the world of Helion, a fortress where the air reeked of incense and discipline. The chamber was vast, filled with banners of the Aquila, its walls lined with statues of saints glaring down in cold judgment. Admirals, generals, priests, and scribes filled the seats in tiered circles, their eyes fixed upon me as I entered. They expected a report numbers, maneuvers, logistics. They wanted mathematics of war, cold and clean. But I did not give them that. I gave them music. I spoke of victories not as equations, but as stories of battles where terror melted into devotion, where suffering became exaltation, where discipline alone had transformed into something more. My voice rose and fell like a hymn, each syllable chosen with precision, each pause heavy with unspoken promise. At first, they frowned. Their quills hovered over parchment, their data slates waiting for figures I never offered. But then I saw it happen. A scribe leaned forward, eyes wide, lips parted. An admiral's stern face softened, his hand frozen mid-note. Even a priest of the ecclesiarchy shifted uneasily, caught between suspicion and fascination, his breath quickening as my words wrapped around him like incense smoke. I watched them crumble, one by one, their objections dulled, their questions faltered, and when I finished, the chamber was silent. Not the silence of disapproval, but the silence of hunger. They did not clap. They did not cheer. Instead, they stared, as if waiting for something more, something they dared not ask. That was the twist I had not just reported. I had converted. Half the chamber left with the seed of longing in their chests, though none would admit it. They would return to their ships and their offices, whispering my words to themselves, replaying the cadence of my voice in the dead of night. The conclave closed with official commendations. They said my methods were innovative, my results remarkable. They thought they had judged me, weighed me, measured me. In truth, it was I who had measured them and found them already willing to bend. That night, as I walked the halls of the bastion, I felt no fear, because I understood the virus of sensation had already reached the heart of command. Admirals and priests alike had carried it home inside themselves, disguised as admiration. The Imperium's leaders would spread my influence further than I ever could alone, and so the lesson was clear. Words are sharper than blades, swifter than ships, deadlier than armies. The right phrase, the right cadence, can conquer where fire cannot. The Imperium had given me a stage, and I had turned it into a pulpit. In that conclave, the galaxy shifted again, not by war, not by blood, but by the sound of my voice. They brought me into the chamber like a criminal, though no chains bound my wrists. The Inquisition does not need chains. Their gaze is enough. Rows of Puritans in black robes sat in judgment, their eyes cold, their voices sharper than any blade. Lucien Veayar, the High Inquisitor intoned, "You stand accused of heresy. Reports speak of visions, of sensations beyond faith, of worship twisted into something unsanctioned. How do you plead I should have been afraid? And I was. Not of death, not of fire, but of exposure, of being stripped bare, my mask torn away, my corruption revealed for all to see. For a heartbeat, I was that young officer again reciting catechisms, trembling under the weight of duty, begging the Emperor for strength. And then I spoke, not in defense, not in denial. I simply let my voice flow, gentle, warm, heavy with sorrow. I told them of loyalty, of sacrifice, of soldiers who fought harder because they felt more deeply. I asked them what crime it was to give men joy in their duty. And as I spoke, I saw it the flicker of doubt in their eyes, the shiver in their breath. They wanted to condemn me, but they could not. Because deep inside, they envied me, envied the devotion I commanded, the ecstasy my crew felt, the fire they themselves had lost long ago. The trial ended without a verdict. They dismissed me, their words harsh but their hearts unsettled. No sentence was passed. No chains were laid. Only silence followed me out of that chamber, heavy and dangerous. I learned something that day. Even the Inquisition, with all its fire and fury, hides its own hollow ache. They judge hardest not because they are pure, but because they are afraid. Afraid of the truth, I carry that worship without joy is only a slow death in disguise. The void was never silent. We tell ourselves it is, that space is an endless emptiness, that the stars burn alone in their frozen silence. But I know better now. The void sings. It began one night as I stood at the observation deck, staring into the abyss. The stars shimmered like a million eyes, cold and unblinking, and yet I felt warmth, as if their gaze pressed into me. Then the hum came not from engines, not from the ship's heart, but from the darkness itself. A resonance too vast to be contained, too intimate to be ignored. I closed my eyes, and the hum became melody. Not one voice, but countless, interwoven, like strands of silk across my skin, like fire and water poured into the marrow of my bones. I felt every breath of my crew, every heartbeat echoing mine, every fragment of desire radiating from them, until the boundaries between us dissolved. We were no longer many, we were one. And then she came, not as a whisper this time, not as the faint perfume of a dream. She came as presence filling every nerve, every thought, every hollow place I had carried for years. Her voice was honey laced with shards of glass, sweetness that cut, agony that soothed. "Lucien," she said, my name vibrating in the marrow of the stars. "You are ready." Visions poured into me, faster than I could breathe. I saw worlds not as spheres of rock, but as instruments, each mountain a chord, each ocean a drumbeat, each city a chorus of living voices. I saw pain and ecstasy twined together, inseparable, two halves of one eternal hymn. I saw mortals shedding their fragile shells, unfolding into beings of impossible beauty, their screams transformed into symphonies that bent reality itself. The stars themselves bent toward me, their light no longer cold, but pulsing with rhythm. I reached out my hand, and it was as if galaxies leaned closer to be touched. I understood then I was no longer servant, no longer officer, no longer the hollow man who once begged the emperor for meaning. I was prophet, not chosen by duty, but by desire itself, not bound to deny, but to embrace. When I opened my eyes, the crew had gathered silently behind me. They too had heard. Their faces glistened with awe, tears shining like jewels in the dim light. They knelt as one, without command, without hesitation, and their voices rose in perfect unison, singing not the hymns of the Imperium, but the harmony I had heard in the void. The ship itself seemed to shudder in ecstasy. Bulkheads groaned like violins under strain. Conduits hummed like choirs. The engines roared in a rhythm older than war. The righteous indignation was no longer just a vessel of steel. It was cathedral, instrument, living hymn, and I, standing at its heart, felt the universe open before me. I had feared the word corruption. I had fled from it, denied it, pretended I still served the emperor. But in that moment, as her voice filled me, I saw the truth. This was not corruption. This was revelation. This was freedom. The void no longer terrified me. It sang, and I sang with it. Sanctus 7 was only the beginning. The galaxy thinks it knows loyalty, thinks it knows devotion. But what I have given my crew, my world, my ship, is something the Imperium will never understand. I still wear the Aquila. I still speak the Emperor's name. To the blind, I am loyal. To the faithful, I am exemplar. But behind the mask, I have become something else entirely. I am the voice that turns duty into desire, pain into pleasure, obedience into worship. And I swear this sector by sector, world by world, I will reshape the Imperium from within. not by fire, not by rebellion, but by the hunger they cannot resist. The administratum will praise my efficiency. The ecclesiarchy will call it renewed zeal. The Inquisition will find nothing but silence when they try to name my heresy. They will never see it coming. I am Lucien Veayar, prophet of sensation, herald of the Dark Prince. I do not seek to destroy the Imperium. I will make it sing.